I simply call Salma or email her, and it's done. I couldn't do the project without her. My job as the director of the Racial Justice Improvement Project is to manage the work being done at all 4 sites. And I want to tell you a little bit about the reforms that each jurisdiction is focused on and how this project is unique. And Norris and G will then focus on what's going on in New Orleans with the project. As Salma said, we have 4 jurisdictions. In Delaware, which is my home state, they've decided to focus on racial disparities with respect to probation revocation. For each jurisdiction, when I initially met with them, I told them they needed to form a working hypothesis. Everyone, in applying for the grant, identified racial disparities in their justice system. And I said, okay, that's fine, but what is your working hypothesis? What do you expect to find? And in Delaware, they said their working hypothesis was that African Americans were being revoked on their probation at a higher rate than their similarly situated white counterparts. That's what they expected to find. They then pulled some initial research and confirmed that suspicion. And so their task has been to figure out why that's happening and then to go forward with a reform to address that disparity and hopefully eliminate it. So they are now in the process of doing a training or preparing for a training session for all probation officers in Delaware on bias-free decision-making. It's a curriculum that Salma helped develop at the ABA and that has been used in a variety of jurisdictions. And that curriculum, very complicated, very comprehensive set of materials. They're available online at the ABA website. Salma can give you access to them if you're interested in doing a training session on bias-free decision-making and sort of recognizing that we all have biases and how not to let your own biases influence the way you work in the criminal justice system. That's a pretty great tool. So anyway, Delaware's working on probation revocation. Brooklyn, New York decided that they wanted to study DUI offenses. Their working theory going in is that DUI should be an equal opportunity offense. You shouldn't have more white people or Latino people committing DUI, and if there was no bias in the system, you wouldn't have a gross disparity. So they hired a consultant with their funds from the grant, and the consultant's job has been to look at all of 2009 DUI arrests, prosecutions, and dispositions, and come up with data to show that, in fact, people are being arrested, prosecuted, detained, sentenced at a disparate rate based upon race. So they're collecting that data now with hopes of identifying where the disparities exist and then developing a reform to address those disparities. And I should say that if at any point you have questions, feel free to raise your hand and we'll answer your questions, and we're going to save some time at the end for questions as well.
Just a technical question.
Sure.
The information or these reports, are they on our zip drive?
No. No. If you want the information, we can definitely make that available to you. The third jurisdiction is St. Louis County, Minnesota, and Duluth is the county seat. And so in Duluth, the Racial Justice Task Force has looked at pretrial detention. And their working hypothesis going in was that African Americans, and then you can imagine there's only a small population of African Americans in Duluth, Minnesota, but African Americans and Native Americans, which is their majority minority population, that they were being detained pretrial at a higher rate and that they were given a higher bail than their similarly situated white counterparts. And so in Duluth, what they decided to do was look at why that's happening. And their theory was, because their county is 190 miles wide, and you can imagine how long it would take you to get 190 miles from where we are, that judges were taking into account the distance that the arrestee lived from the courthouse in deciding whether to detain the person. Now, that may be a legitimate consideration. If you live in Philadelphia and you're arrested in DC, maybe the judge should give you a higher bail or consider detaining you if the judge feels like you might not come back to court. The problem is Native Americans live on the reservation, which is inevitably very far from the courthouse. So if that is the policy that's going on, it is having a disparate impact, having nothing to do with intentional racism. So they're studying that right now in Duluth. That's their reform. And then if they find that that's the case in their preliminary data suggests that is the case, that definitely African Americans and Native Americans are subjected to a higher bail and they're detained pretrial at a higher rate, they're going to propose a reform to address that. And then that brings us to New Orleans. And G Park is now here, and Norris Henderson's here, and they're going to talk more specifically about New Orleans, but they've decided in New Orleans to focus on diversion. In New Orleans, the district attorney's office runs the only diversion program, and it is not the case, and we haven't identified a racial disparity within the diversion program, but because New Orleans is so overwhelmingly African American, the criminal justice system is overwhelmingly African American, we want to try to develop a reform that will reduce the impact on the African American community. And one of the disparities that has been uncovered recently, and Norris will talk a little more about that, is in the pretrial phase. It is our hope to improve the capacity of the diversion program, to develop reforms in New Orleans that will improve the quality of the diversion program and enhance the services that are being provided. And so we actually just met yesterday and talked about some of the potential reforms, things like GED education as a condition of diversion, or other things along those lines, services for the Latino community, which are currently not available in the diversion program. So those are some of the options on the table. We're still in the early stages of trying to figure out who can be diverted, who's not currently being diverted, to reduce the racial impact in New Orleans. So those are the 4 projects under the umbrella of this ABA Racial Justice Improvement Project. It's a 2-year grant. We started in October. We've made significant progress since October. This fall, we're going to bring all 4 groups together, and by the end of the summer, they should have data supporting the reforms they're working on to justify the existence of the reforms, because this is going to be an evidence-based approach. Because then in the second year, once the reform is implemented, we will measure the impact of that reform. How many people are diverted? What is the rate of probation revocation? In each jurisdiction will be able to come back with a measured result. And the hope is that at the end of this process, we will have identified an approach to racial justice reform in the criminal justice system that will be capable of being replicated in other jurisdictions. That notion of bringing together the key stakeholders, and in our jurisdictions, as Salma mentioned, the judiciary and the prosecution, the defense, the police, and the community, bringing all of those groups together and working on policy reforms. All of the reforms that each jurisdiction is working on are not things that will require a change in law, overturning a statute, or overturning a court opinion. They're all policy reforms. Either the chief of police, the chief judge, the prosecutor, they can just simply change the policy, the way they do business, and have a positive impact on the racial disparity. So I'm going to turn it over to G Park, who's going to talk a little bit about her work with the task force in New Orleans, and basically how the task force has functioned so far, and how they've come to work on the diversion issue. And then Norris is going to talk a little bit about what's going on in New Orleans in terms of the criminal justice system and what his organization does.
So I'm the coordinator for the New Orleans office, New Orleans task force, and I actually work in the public defender's office and their special litigation counsel there. But they're separate and apart from me. Another representative, our executive, actually assistant director, is also part of the task force. So who's on our task force? There is a representative from the district attorney's office, a representative from the public defender's office, a representative from